Maybe you've already experienced it, but more and more companies are actually charging if you do not consent to them having all your data. Most notably, Instagram and Facebook have started to charge a subscription fee in Europe if you do not consent and give up your right to privacy. What's up with this system? Where does it come from? And what is actually the background of it? You'll find out right now. News media used to be big business. They made a lot of money from advertisement and from subscriptions, and that was usually something where they had more than enough cash on hand. However, that declined obviously. A lot of the advertisement moved online, and a lot of the subscriptions were gone because people don't subscribe to newspapers anymore. So gradually they can really have a financing issue, and that is a serious issue that we have in the European Union, how to finance quality journalism. One of these newspapers had a wonderful idea. When the GDPR came in 2018, they actually used the cookie banners that we all know to push their subscriptions. That newspaper was actually a local newspaper here in Vienna called Der Standard, and they started the idea of a pay or okay consent banner, where they basically gave you the option to say either you agree to all the cookies that we place and all the tracking, or you now have to have a subscription with our newspaper. Obviously, at the time, we were already quite skeptical about it, but what happened is that because it was news media, that was pretty much permitted. At the time, we have already raised that the GDPR does not differentiate between different types of companies. So if a newspaper can do that, logically, any other organization like Google or Meta could do the same. And guess what? Exactly that happened. Usually, the main argument for pay or okay is simple economics. If you want to go to a website and want to enjoy content, then basically you have to pay one way or another, either with your personal data or by paying a subscription. That sinks in with a lot of people and they think that's reasonable, but if you look a little bit closer, you realize that's not really what they're doing. If you take Meta, for example, they charge €20.99 per user if you use Facebook and Instagram. And if you extrapolate that and just estimate that an average user in Europe has 35 apps on their phone, you realize that that would amount to more than €8,000 per user per year that you pay just to keep your fundamental right to privacy for one phone, not including websites, for example. If you go on and you are like, okay, this is a family of 4, you end up with more than €35,000 you would have to pay to actually keep your information secure just on your phone, just for the average number of apps. That's more than the average income in the European Union. So one of the two parents would have to work only for pay or okay to actually be able to afford that. That is not overly realistic. These numbers are actually sounding crazy, but that's pretty much what they are. You get to rather similar results if you look at the overall statistics of the advertisement market. The IAB, the main lobby organization for the ad industry in Europe, is publishing these numbers, and they say on average they make €1.41 on a user in the whole European Union for all the websites, all the apps, everything you're doing in the digital space. That is basically the revenue that is generated by all of them per month per user. That's interesting if you compare that to up to €10 that just one website partly charges if you are in a pay or okay system. So also on that side, you can see these numbers don't really add up. What's important to note is these are the numbers for the entire advertisement ecosystem. So all the way from the original person placing the advertisement, all the data brokers and all the networks in between, and then the final website that actually shows the advertisement. It's important to note that the publisher, the last one in a row that basically does this pay or okay models right now, usually does not get the whole part of this pie, they only get the last little bit. So if you also take that into consideration, these numbers are even lower than anything that the IAB publishes right now. So if you take an honest approach to the pay or okay system from an economical point of view, you can see that people actually get screwed because they pay much more in a pay or okay system than their data is actually worth. In addition, if you run the numbers on all the websites, you would realize that if that is a system that becomes dominant, only the richest people could actually afford to have a fundamental right to privacy anymore, and that fundamental right would basically be not available to anybody that is not extremely rich and above average. So if all of this is already a bit of a scam from a user perspective, did we at least save the news media, which is the main argument for pay or okay? If you look at the numbers there, you realize that, for example, Der Standard, where there are public numbers, which was the first website that introduced pay or okay, actually has not gained much revenue over the years. If you actually adjust it for inflation, you realize they have gone down too. So it did not save them and did not turn around the overall problem. So what we see from these numbers is we're basically throwing free consent under the bus with PRK, but actually do not save the news media, which is a larger political problem that we're not going to solve by changing the interpretation of the GDPR. So besides the economic argument, how does PRK actually go down with users? We know that about, depending on the study, 3 to 10% of the people actually want to have personalized advertisement. If you ask them if they also want to have the tracking that comes with it, usually the numbers go down, but let's, for the sake of the argument, take the 10%. If you compare that to PRK, we actually have numbers of 2 providers. One is the Austrian newspaper that started it, Der Standard. They have a 99.9% consent rate. So basically, there is more than 90% of people that do not actually say no, despite not wanting to have advertisement in a PRK system. This is backed up by very similar numbers by a German provider called Content Pass. They have published that they also have a 99.9% consent rate. So what we really have here is pretty North Korean results. And that is not really what you want to call free consent or anything that people really want around their fundamental rights. If you dig a bit into why that is, there is a lot of psychological reasons on top of the economic reasons. For example, people usually have loss aversion. People are very worried about losing money. So if you are told that you get a €5 discount if you sign up for a newsletter, this would be less of an incentive than if you have to pay €5 to keep your data. It's the same €5, but people have a different feeling about losing it. There's other elements like that people have a certain reference point. If they feel that these services used to be free for the last 20 or 30 years, there's a lot of resistance to actually pay for that. So overall, a lot of these numbers are quite brutal. More than 90% change their view in a PRK system, so it's really not their free choice rather than that they're pushed in that direction. There are countless other factors that interfere with the decision of a user, but currently there's almost no studies to really look into how freely people actually consent or give up their right to privacy. So after having all these facts on the table, what does the law actually say about PRK? In the European Union, the right to privacy and your right to data protection is a fundamental right. And usually fundamental rights are adverse to payment options. You cannot sell your right to vote, for example, because that is generally seen as something that should be outside of the economic sphere. With the right to privacy and data protection, that is debated, but usually there is a lot of resistance in that. We see that in the GDPR as well, where a lot of your rights, like your right to access or to delete data or rectify your data, is always free by law. The GDPR does not specifically say anything about consent. However, it does say that withdrawing your consent, so taking back your consent, must be as easy as giving it. So if you charge for one but not for the other, that may already be a bit of a tricky situation in the GDPR. So right now, where most of the legal debate boils down to is the words freely given in the GDPR. The law basically provides that only if you freely give consent, if it's a genuine choice that you made, that actually then your consent is valid and otherwise it's not. Now, knowing that only 3% of the people, maybe 10, actually want something and 99.9% of the people get it, that may be a fair argument to say this is actually not freely given consent. There is some case law around that would also be probably irrelevant. For example, the Court of Justice held that unticking a tick box would already be too much to ask for, and that would not be valid consent. I think if you compare that to untick a box versus paying €5, most people would be like, unticking the box is easier. So on that side, we may already have an argument. Talking about case law, some of the people that actually use PRK rely on a rather recent judgment by the Court of Justice. In the judgment, as in previous judgments, they basically said there has to be free and genuine choice, people have to have the option to say no, etc. But there are 6 little words in the long judgment that also indicate that there could be a payment option. Now that is what Meta and others rely on. If that's really what the Court of Justice meant is unclear. In that specific case, the PRK system was not in front of the court, was not argued. All the facts that were in this video, for example, were not discussed. So we'll see if that really stands, but that is what the other side is arguing right now, that it may not be free, but the Court of Justice said it's fine. So what's next in this whole debate? As of the taping of this video, there is a couple of fronts that are open for Meta and anybody else using PRK. Right now, this whole issue is in front of the European Data Protection Board. That is all the European data protection authorities combined that will have to decide about this whole matter. There is one decision that's going to be on Meta, but there is also going to be a bigger decision that will be on pay or pay in general, which is done through general guidelines. In addition to that, the European Commission has announced that they also investigate the matter under the Digital Markets Act. That's a new law that also requires consent for certain processing operations, where the Commission is in charge of the investigation. So we'll see what comes out of that. However, both of these decisions will probably be appealed and at some point end up at the Court of Justice, which will then have to say finally what these 6 words in their first judgment actually really mean.